Welcome back, folks. My name's Shane. In today's video, I'm going to share with you a bit of a retrospective review talking about one of my favorite cameras of all time, the Panasonic LUMIX GH5 Mark II. That's right, not the GH6, not the G9 Mark II, but the GH5 Mark II. This kind of lived in the shadow of the GH6 because when the GH5 Mark II was released, they announced the GH6 alongside it, so everybody waited for the GH6. The GH5 Mark II actually has a few benefits over the GH6, which we'll talk about throughout this video, and after shooting with one extensively for a few years, I can tell you that there's a lot to like about this particular camera. Anytime I traveled, I took the GH5 Mark II with me, so you'll see plenty of samples from the camera, just shooting in the natural picture profile, and the image quality out of this camera is really something special. For those who don't know the channel, I do own full frame cameras. I also have APS-C cameras and micro four thirds. Sure, the GH5 Mark II might not be a perfect camera, but none of them are. And if you know what you're looking for, and if you know how to get great results out of your camera system, then it almost makes no difference. We're gonna talk more about that throughout this video. Let's cover image quality. So one of the benefits of the GH5 Mark II over the original GH5 is that we can shoot at 4K up to 60 frames per second in 420 10-bit. Now this isn't 422 10-bit, it's 420, but I actually shoot in 420 all the time. One, the files are much smaller, it's still 10-bit colors, and it looks exceptional, and I'm using that right now, and I don't think the image quality will be anything to turn your nose up at. So if you're like me and you like to work with smaller file sizes that are also really easy to edit, 420 10-bit is great. You can also see the thumbnails on your computer as well, unlike 422 10-bit where it just comes up as a file icon. Let's take a look at some sample footage shot with the Panasonic GH5 Mark II. This was all shot at 4K 60 frames per second with a 12 to 35mm f2.8 zoom lens. Let's take a look. Rhiannon and I are thinking about going back to Hawaii, and that was kind of the inspiration for me to dig up the footage that you're looking at right now. I shot everything with the GH5 Mark II with that 12 to 35mm f2.8 zoom lens, and the results look spectacular. One of the biggest benefits to micro four thirds is that we don't get an insane shallow depth of field look. And when you're traveling, you want to actually be able to see everything in the frame, and some of these shots are some of my favorite. Now at f2.8, we're still getting f2.8 light, so I could blur out the background if I wanted to some extent, but it definitely won't look as blurry as full frame. And I think for this particular type of shoot, it worked great, and the image quality looks really beautiful. Sure, there's a time and place to blur out the background to the nth degree, but when you're traveling and you're shooting landscapes and scenery and all that kind of stuff, that's really not the time unless you're going for some sort of arty effect. So I got more than enough background blur with the f2.8 to keep me satisfied, and paired with the GH5 Mark II, I think the image quality looks beautiful. Let's talk about the in-body image stabilization. This is another reason why I love the GH5 Mark II. Now this has been improved not only on the GH6 but also on the G9 Mark II, which now gives us some active modes. I would love to see those active modes come to the GH6 and GH5 Mark II, but I'm not sure that they will. So the G9 Mark II is in a whole other league, but you do get a crop. If you just want to get your standard field of view without any crops, the GH6 and GH5 Mark II are still excellent performers. You get up to 6.5 stops with the GH5 Mark II in combination with that 12 to 35mm lens, which then gives us optical image stabilization. And the results look great. All the footage that you're looking at was shot handheld in a vlogging scenario just by holding the camera. We also get an IS boost feature which allows you to get almost a tripod looking shot when holding the camera handheld. I actually found this to perform slightly better than the original GH5, which also performs great. So yeah, the GH5 Mark II will give you excellent stabilization results. Now if you plan on vlogging or doing anything like that, pairing this camera with an optically stabilized lens gives you the best results, and that brings in dual IS2, which just simply looks great. So while it's not as stable as the GH6 or the G9 Mark II, the GH5 Mark II will still give you excellent results. Now let's talk about slow motion or variable frame rate mode. So I did shoot quite a bit with the GH5 Mark II at 1080p at 120 frames per second outside on a bright sunny day, and in those sort of situations the footage looks great. I don't think Panasonic gets enough credit for its 1080p footage. I think 1080p on most Lumix cameras looks awesome, and when you put that on a 4K timeline and export it at 4K, you're going to get excellent results, as you can see from these examples. Without question, if you've got a 4 or 5K display and you're looking at the difference between 4K at 120 frames per second and 1080p, there's a huge difference. But for those people who only shoot slow motion occasionally, and or if you'll be shooting outside in good lighting conditions, then that 1080p footage can look fantastic. One of the hacks you can use with this particular camera system to get the most out of it is to shoot all of your A-roll, or talking to the camera for example, at 24 frames per second. Then when you switch over to 4K 60, you can slow that right down more than 50%, and this will give you an almost 4K 120 look to the footage. It really does slow it down more than 50%. I think it's around 40% or so. So this allows you to really get the most out of the camera, and when you drop that footage into the timeline on 24p, it looks fantastic. The GH5 Mark II has a few major advantages over the GH6. The first being that the GH6 battery life is pretty terrible. It feels like we can't even shoot for an hour before it runs out. The GH5 Mark II can run for much longer in the same or comparable frame rate. So if you plan on shooting at 4K 60, you'll get much better runtime out of the GH5 Mark II than on the GH6. They have the same exact battery, the BLK22, but the GH5 Mark II allows you to shoot for a much longer period of time. Secondly, the GH5 Mark II has terminals on the bottom like the original GH5, so we can use an external battery grip, doubling our runtime. You know, while we were in Hawaii, we were shooting at some of the guitar shops all day. I had the battery grip on. I never had to change the batteries. That's how long the batteries last. So while it's not as iconic as I think the GH4 had crazy battery life, the GH5 Mark II's battery life is a lot better than the GH6. One of the great features built into the GH5 Mark II that you don't even find on the GH6 is the live streaming capability. Now, while this wasn't something that I would use, if you ended up needing to go live, you could go live just by tapping the shutter button on the camera once you set it up in combination with the LUMIX Sync app. Providing you got good internet, you'd have no problems going live in a pinch. So this is a really great feature, and if you're doing any sort of IRL, in real life type footage for YouTube or whatever the case may be, this might make the entire process a lot easier, and you can still get excellent image quality. Now let's talk about autofocus performance. So if you want the best in autofocus in Micro Four Thirds, the G9 Mark II is on a whole other level. And if you haven't used a phase detect camera in a long time or ever, and you're coming from contrast DFD, there's a massive difference, not only in how confident you are just walking into a frame and having it track you, but also the ability to hand the camera off to someone else who has less experience and having the autofocus just work. And that's always something that I can appreciate. This is the biggest reason why I ended up moving over to the S5 Mark II cameras, because anytime I need that phase detection autofocus, not that I use it all the time, but when I do need it, it's there and it's really helpful. It saves me having to go back and reshoot something over and over. With all of that said, the GH5 Mark II outperformed the original GH5 when it came to autofocus performance, and it was somewhere around the same league as the original S5. Now there's some tips and tricks to getting the most out of the autofocus performance, and if you missed my video on that, I'll link it up in the cards. But the faster the lens, the more trouble and more hunting you'll find with autofocus. So if you stop down to f2 or f2.8, generally the autofocus performance will improve greatly. So that's just a quick tip, but I highly recommend checking out my video. Phase detection autofocus is an absolute deal maker or breaker for people, but if you're not too scared to turn things into manual focus from time to time, you're going to get excellent results out of this camera. Now let's quickly just talk about this lens. This is the 12 to 35mm f2.8 lens. Now, while this doesn't seem as exciting as the 10 to 25 or 25 to 50 f1.7, and it's sure you're not going to get the same sort of subject separation with this lens as those bigger, more expensive lenses, this is so great for travel. It's your one and done lens. If you're not too concerned about having only your eye in focus or your ear in focus or whatever the case may be, this is the perfect travel lens. I love the fact we get that constant light. It's small, it's lightweight, we get optical image stabilization. I think it's a great pairing for any Micro Four Thirds camera, but especially for the GH5 Mark II. So if you haven't guessed already, yes, I traded in my Panasonic GH5 Mark II for an S5 Mark II. I really wanted to complete my multi-camera setup when it came to full frame cameras, but I really regret it because it's such a great camera. Black Friday's kind of just gone and I've been eyeballing off different prices. I've noticed that the GH5 Mark II is extremely good value, at least here in Australia anyway, so I'm seriously considering buying another one. While the GH5 Mark II didn't have the best low light performance or phase hybrid autofocus, what it does have is exceptional image quality, great handling, no overheating and no additional crop. So you can switch between 30 frames and 60 frames, and you're not going to notice any sort of punch-in like you would find with some of Panasonic's full-frame cameras. So the great news is this is still a very viable camera even in 2023 going into 2024.